So some things to think about in selection and selecting those replacement females. We've got the data, and so when if you're raising your own replacement females, utilize bulls that have some predictability in them. And the one way to do that is, as we've talked about, utilizing EPDs, expected progeny differences, and looking at maternal calving ease on those bulls, milk, docility, stayability. Those can help you begin to improve the genetics within your herd and try to select for more of a targeted production scenario there. The thing is with EPDs, they're not available for commercial cattle, but you can utilize them in maybe selecting your bulls to help raise and produce those replacement females for you. Within herd records are important. So the performance of the dam, whether or not it's as simple as if she missed a calf during her lifetime, or if she always calved early in the calving season, or what was her weaning weights of that cow, and maybe even also as we look at how did she maintain her body condition score over a period of time. So some data on those cattle, on the dams of the heifers that you keep, but also maybe the sisters and other siblings there as well. So some things to think about. Also, yearling scrotal circumference of the sire, because that's an indicator of maturity in those cattle and age at puberty. So we would expect heifers out of sires with a larger testicular or larger scrotal circumference, those heifers would reach puberty earlier. So there's a direct relationship or correlation between as scrotal circumference increases, heifers will reach maturity or puberty at an earlier age. So that's something to think about as well. And then also, what are the breed characteristics? And it goes back to that environmental adaptation, but also the birth weight of those cattle, milk production, calving ease, the disposition. All of those factors go into and are certainly selection age for you. And then visual appraisal, as when we look at these cattle, as we talked about before, evaluating them for structural integrity. So making sure that they will be able to survive for a long term, and we don't have to let them fall out of the operation because maybe some kind of structural challenge in them. The other thing is looking at femininity of the cattle, as well as muscling and depth and shape of rib, and just overall balance and eye appeal go into the selection process as well. So some things that we think about, some key points in replacement females, disposition is something that's important. Again, we don't necessarily have to have replacement females that are halter broke and that are gentle enough to pet, but those cattle that are hard to manage because they're always about a half a mile from you, that's as close as you can get, or those that are some challenge whenever we're trying to gather those cattle, they can be the one that can bust the herd up. And so disposition is important, and cattle that can be managed. Born early in the calving season, something to think about too, because those cattle that are born earlier in the calving season, those heifers were probably from dams that settled, were bred earlier in the calving season, so they're likely more fertile. Then also another thing to think about, if they're born early in the calving season, they're going to have an advantage on weight at weaning as well. And so then it takes less time to get from weaning to that targeted weight when we're trying to breed those cattle. Again, same thing on the heavy weaning weights. If they're heavier at weaning, we have there's less weight to get from weaning until we breed him. We're typically shooting for about 60-65% of their mature weight at breeding of those cattle. One thing that we have to caution is if we're just selecting strictly for heaviest weaning weight heifers, we also could be selecting for an increased size and maturity too. And so we have to be careful. But most often, heifers that are heavier at weaning were probably born earlier in that calving season, and that's the advantage there. And then we talked about skeletal and muscle and just overall conformation, how important it is. And femininity. looking at how that animal looks out of the head, neck, and shoulders, and angular in its pattern. And so I always relate it to is your set of heifers ought to look like heifers out there. If you look out across your pen of heifers and there's one that looks maybe like a bull or a steer that's slipped in there, there may be a problem there. And then also the genitalia as well, to make sure the vulva is formed correctly. There's not any glaring problems with udder. On weaned heifers, it's a little harder to look and evaluate that udder, but you can begin to see some big problems, maybe some extra long teats, or a heifer that's got 2 or 3 extra teats on her as well. So things like that you can begin to look at and call early rather than later after you've placed some money in them in the development phase.